another case, Judge, St. Clair versus Commonwealth, which is at 140 Southwest 3rd 510. In that case, where's the language? At the trial or upon any hearing, a part of a deposition so far as otherwise admissible under the rules of evidence may be used if it appears from the witness that the witness is dead or that the witness is out of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, unless it appears that the absence of the witness was procured by the party offering the deposition, or that the witness is unable to attend or testify because of sickness or infirmity, or that the party offering the deposition has been unable to procure the attendance of the witness by subpoena. Again, Judge, I feel that it's not that Miles Cosgrove's deposition in a civil case is not admissible in a criminal case. It's trying to put apples into oranges, and I don't think that's proper under the rules of evidence.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Whaley or Mr. Finke?
Judge, as the court stated, Mr. Matthews, as of Friday, asked for the entire deposition. So we haven't done research on this now.
That's understandable.
But we would stand on the original memorandum filed in regard to witness Mattingly. And we did cite cases, in particular U.S. versus Vartanian, United States versus Vartanian, which was a Sixth Circuit opinion, 245 F3rd 609, wherein a deposition in a civil case was used in the criminal case when the witness invoked the Fifth Amendment. So we can go back and stand on that. But his lawyer was there, and again, Ohio versus Roberts, United States Supreme Court, 448 U.S. 56, stated it does not have to be the same attorney who represented the defendant at the deposition as in the current criminal trial. His attorneys were there, 2 attorneys were there at this deposition, the deposition of Cosgrove. 2 of Hankison's attorneys were there and did participate, actually, throughout the deposition. The fact that he was not there, he was present by video, I don't know if that means Zoom. How video, how he was present. Almost completed the evidence this evening.
Really?
Yes, we have. That's Mr. Finke.
Sure it was.
Working late. That is important. We would ask to be admitted.
And to use it. Sometime this morning?
Sometime today.
All right. Well, let's just hold off for because obviously the change in position. So
Eventually view the video and change my position again.
that's fine. We can do that too.
It'll take Mr. Finke about 20 minutes.
That's fine. That's fine. All right.
The issue of the to Sergeant Mattingly does plan to call a witness
I'll stipulate that.
Well, the court, that he did, that the jury wouldn't think. So that could do a stipulation, yeah.
Assume that wouldn't take.
Do we have them all?
I have a
Just about. I think we're just about ready. And proceed, Ms. Whaley, with other witnesses and with Mr. Cosgrove. One other thing, ladies and gentlemen who are and the spectators, you're not allowed to have, so keep it in your briefcase, backpack, have it out. You're not allowed to be on it or use it in the courtroom. With it out, you will be told to leave the courtroom. Problem, then I'm going to order the sheriffs to courtroom. There were some issues that arose Friday. I'm very serious about this. Please, you take it seriously. To be able to remain and watch this trial without cell phones. All right.
give me a minute to line them all up and I'll bring it in.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Hope you had a nice 3 days away from the courthouse and are ready to get back into the trial again. Is there anything that any of you have to report from our 3-day break? All right, if not, then we'll proceed. Ms. Whaley, if you're ready to call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Commonwealth calls Matt Gelhausen.
If you'll take a seat, please.
Yes, ma'am.
If you raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may take your mask off while you're testifying if you wish to, but you're not required to.
Thank you.
Would you state your name and also spell it, please?
Yes, ma'am. It's Matthew Gelhausen, Gelhausen,
And how are you employed?
with the Louisville Metro Police Department.
And how long have you been with Louisville Metro Police?
Been with Louisville Metro Police for 14 years.
What is your position?
I'm assigned to the training division of the Training Academy for the Firearms Training Center as a firearms instructor.
Are you certified as a firearms instructor?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
And how did you get to that certification?
So the Commonwealth of Kentucky requires to be a firearms instructor that you have to have a certification through the Department of Criminal Justice Training, which is also a Kentucky Law Enforcement Council certified course to be a firearms instructor, which for me with the time period when I went was a 2-week certifiable course. In addition to that, there's also a Kentucky Law Enforcement Council course to be a course or to be an instructor for the Kentucky Law Enforcement Council is also a DOCJT, Department of Criminal Justice Training course. That was a 2-week course as well.
As firearms instructor, where do you conduct the trainings and the qualification for officers?
Most of the trainings and qualifications for the Louisville Metro Police Department are held at the Louisville Metro Police Firearms Training Center here within Louisville, Jefferson County. We have a facility there that has an indoor range. But because we are limited sometimes based upon the training we're trying to do, that we have to go to other off-site facilities that have outdoor ranges. But most of the training and qualifications are done at our facility here in Louisville, Jefferson County.
As firearms instructor, did you conduct the fall 2019 qualification and training for the Louisville officers?
I was one of the firearms instructors present during that year and during that fall 2019.
And what date was that training and qualification?
So the training and qualification for fall usually will start around September and then go until into the month of December.
And you were asked to provide documentation that the defendant, Brett Hankison, participated on that day in qualification and training.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, that training was a full day.
Yes, ma'am. It was a
Correct.
full 8-hour day.
Is that normally the case with the fall training?
So our agency typically over the years has strived to always have, there's 2 qualifications that the officers go through, a spring and also a fall qualification. The spring usually may be an on-duty qualification, meaning you're coming in and qualifying and leaving, or you may be there for 4 hours, just depends upon the structure. But traditionally the fall, the agency has usually chosen that to be an 8-hour day to where at that point there's qualifications as well as training that's conducted.
149. And does that document show the schedule for the fall training in 2019?
Yes, ma'am, it does.
And it fairly and accurately depicts the actual schedule that took place that day for the officers.
Yes, ma'am.
So would move to admit Exhibit 149 and display for the jury.
No objection.
All right, it'll be so admitted.
Behind you now and over to your right is a display of the schedule for the fall training. And I'm going to hand you a laser pointer and ask that you explain to the jury what was the schedule.
Yes, ma'am. So, as I stated previously, the agency's tried to have a qualification time period of twice a year. With that, the fall's traditionally been the 8-hour day. During that, it's structured in such that I mentioned qualifications and also training. So the officers, when they first arrive, they come into the classroom. They arrive into the classroom. There's a sign-in sheet where they'll sign their name and their code number to verify that they're present at that time, during that training. With that, too, we will have a firearms inspection. So usually that fall qualification is the time period, as I'll get into in a minute, that they qualify with all firearms that they choose to use within the job or for off-duty while within Jefferson County. Since they have to qualify with those at that time period, the weapons are inspected to meet policy to make sure that they fall within policy as well as the specifications for the Firearms Training Center. So we conduct a firearms inspection of those firearms at that time period. And then we go into a PowerPoint which covers some different things that we wish to discuss during the time period. Usually that's where this slide that's on the screen is also included within that PowerPoint to show and give the officers an idea of what they're going to be doing for the day. So in that PowerPoint, we will go over a refresher on a low light handheld flashlight review and refreshing the officers on that, as well as getting into fundamentals of marksmanship. And we did a review on those as well, and then telling them also about what else is needed or going to be exposed to for them for the day, such as the duty ammo changeout that comes at the end of the day. So as they progress through it, we tell them that we'll do the fundamentals review in the classroom. Once we're done with that, then we will break and we will go over to the adjacent range that's next door to the classroom building. And when we get over there, the first qualification that the officers will get their loadout for and load their magazines for will be that Class A on-duty handgun low-light qualification. That one there is the officers, that's their full-size duty pistol by policy that they would be carrying when they're in uniform with their gun belt on, conducting their daily job duties, if that's whatever that full-size pistol is by policy. So everybody would do that low-light handgun qualification, and then immediately after that, the lights would fully come on within the range, and then we would progress through those officers that have any of these next listed firearms, and we'll work down through all of those. Once we've completed those and conducted the qualifications for all of those that have those firearms or they're continuing to carry those and qualifying with them, then we would break for lunch. After lunch, they'd return, and what we did in fall of 2019 is we broke the class up into two different groups. One group went to the range for handgun fundamentals training, and then the other group went and did a selected simulation or situation on the firearms training simulator within the classroom building. Once each group completed their tasks, then they would swap and switch so that the other group that had just done the firearms simulator would go do the handgun fundamentals training, and then those that just completed the fundamentals training would come do the firearms simulator. During that time period is that we told the officers that while they were waiting to do the simulator, they had time during this, if they wished to do so, then they could clean their firearms as well and accomplish firearms cleaning during that portion of time. At the end, before they left, we swap out duty ammunition. We go through a procedure that after a certain number of years within the agency, that the duty ammunition will be swapped out for new fresh duty ammunition due to being exposed to climate conditions, different types of atmosphere situations that we need to replace that ammunition to give them newer ammunition. And we go over this schedule with them, as I said, within that PowerPoint during the beginning.
So the PowerPoint is done in the classroom in the morning, the fundamentals review, and you said that included marksmanship? Would that include review of how to use the sights on the weapon, on the
So,
gun?
yes, ma'am. In fall of 2019, we wanted to also emphasize to the officers a review again about the fundamentals of marksmanship, and particularly pistol marksmanship, and working on that and just trying to instill the importance of practicing the fundamentals of pistol marksmanship appropriately. So we would go over what those were during that time period while they were in the classroom, and just refresh them on it, demonstrate some of that to them as well, to give them a better idea once we've gone over to the range building.
In the PowerPoint, is there a slide and an explanation of firearms safety rules?
Yes, ma'am, there is. I believe it was on the fourth slide. There's a slide titled Firearms Safety Rules.
And I'm handing you a document marked Commonwealth Exhibit 150. Is that the slide number 4 that you just described,
Yes, ma'am, it is.
listing firearms safety rules?
Yes, ma'am.
And is that the slide, that document, a fair and accurate representation of the slide that was used in the PowerPoint?
Yes, ma'am.
Would move to admit Exhibit 150
No objection.
It'll be so admitted.
and display for the jury. Now, if you would point to the screen behind you and explain for us the bullet points under the firearms safety rules that were discussed during the morning training.
Yes, ma'am. So, again, as we go through the PowerPoint, and this being the fourth slide that was present within that PowerPoint presentation that was given to the officers in the classroom, we go through the importance in just refreshing their memory of the firearms safety rules as they were told and taught and instructed on, whether they were in their police recruit training academy in the very beginning to even every time they deal with or are exposed to firearms. And refreshing them, we have the firearms safety rules. The first is treat all weapons as if they're loaded. Another way to think about that is know the status of every weapon system that you have at all times. Just being aware and treating it that it's loaded and being aware of what status that firearm is within. All right. The second one is the always keeping the muzzle pointed in a safe direction. Just being aware and being cognizant is that the muzzle end and ultimately where the bullet is going to be coming out of the firearm, being aware of where that muzzle's pointing it, and we're not going to cross or point the muzzle at something that we're not wanting to use the firearm on. The third is the keeping your trigger finger high and outside the trigger guard until you've made the decision to shoot. Ultimately, understanding is that what is going to make that firearm to be able to operate is the trigger mechanism, the trigger on that pistol. And with that is understanding is that keeping that trigger finger high and away from the trigger until you've made that decision that you're going to shoot. And then the fourth is always knowing your target or your threat in the foreground and the background. So that's always knowing what your threat or your target is that you've identified, but then also knowing what's around it, what's in front of it, what's beside it, what's beyond it, what's behind it, things like that.
And we'll come back to that last one as we move through. Now, you stated that after the classroom presentation, that you would then move to the range and actually begin the qualification process.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think you stated that the first weapon to be qualified with, or the first circumstance, was a low light situation.
Yes, ma'am,
Would you
that's correct.
explain what that is?
Yes, ma'am. So we have within our agency by policy that out of those two qualifications that are done a year that I mentioned to you, one being the spring qualification and one being the fall, one of those two qualifications, one is done in a daylight setting and one is done in a low light setting. Low light is not completely no light, but it's where you have still some present ambient light that we are able to leave some lights on in the range to provide some ambient light to the officers while they're out there qualifying and giving some illumination. So it's a low light setting, and that qualification was the one that was conducted during the fall of 2019 qualification.
And now I'm handing you a document marked Commonwealth Exhibit 151.
Thank you.
Will you explain what that document is?
We're going to put it on the screen.
Well, we will after you
Okay,
explain
sorry.
and tell
Thank
us what's on it.
So this document that you just handed me was the LMPD pistol low light qualification. It describes ultimately the loadout, the target tree that's utilized for the scoring of that qualification, the scoring, how that's done, as well as the stages that encompass that, the 10 stages for the qualification.
And that document accurately reflects this, what is asked of the officer for low light qualification.
Yes, ma'am.
Would move to admit Exhibit 151 and display to the jury.
No objection.
It'll be so admitted.
Okay, now you can look at the document on the screen with your pointer. Maybe we can enlarge it and just scroll down. So you said that there are how many stages for the low light qualification?
The low light qualification has 10 stages.
And so we see stage one. Just explain what they have to do in stage one.
Yes, ma'am. So stage one would be at the 3-yard line. You'll see that there's columns that notate here. So stage one starting will be at the 3-yard line. And they were going to be firing 3 rounds for each repetition. There's going to be 2 repetitions for this stage. They're going to start from a forward grip at the hip or a loaded shoulder with the flashlight. So as the procedure column will define that a little further, I'll read it to you. It says that their officers are going to be starting from the holster. Start holstered, and the flashlight is being held in a forward grip at the hip position with the handheld flashlight, or in a loaded shoulder position with the flashlight. The light is already going to be on, so it's simulating that they're maybe walking up to a car on a vehicle traffic stop. They may be walking around a building on a burglar alarm or a burglary in progress situation, something like that, to where maybe they're trying to survey a perimeter. So they're holding a handheld flashlight in one of these 2 positions. The light's already on, and then once the threat and the targets would turn to face, on how our range is set up, is once the targets would face, then that is symbolizing that a threat, an active threat, is now present. And with that active threat now being present, the officers would draw from the holster and fire 3 rounds, strong hand only. So firing full extension, putting the arm all the way out to full extension, and firing 3 rounds while still holding that flashlight from a loaded shoulder or a forward grip position. They have 6 seconds for that stage. That means while that target is then turned or facing and exposed at that time period, until it edges and goes to where it's no longer showing. With that, there's 2 repetitions, as I stated, so they would do this twice, which gets you 6 rounds for the stage, and then keeping up with the round count for total on the far right column, there's 6 rounds that would be done for that stage, if done according to the stage.
What does the target look like?
The target is our LMPD standard qualification target. It's a blue target. It's based off of an IPSC, International Practical Shooting Confederation target, to where basically what that is that you have the outline of a silhouette. You have a head and you have a body, and then there were scoring zones within that area. An outer line, similar as we could maybe call like a Coke bottle or like a bottle. And then you have an inner line or an A zone rectangular area in the middle. Okay, and that's what that target would be that was utilized, and it's the LMPD standard qualification target that would be used for firearms training then.
So it's the silhouette of a human body.
Yes, ma'am. It's basically the target is about the size of, for example, it's the size of about the size of a human body as far as height and width, and the targetry would be about the size of probably a poster board, for example, symbolizing that width is also that height. And it goes from the head, where you have the symbolic of the silhouette of the head, down to about where the belt buckle region or pelvic girdle area would start.
And the targets are moved by mechanical means during these exercises?
Yes, ma'am. So the targetry on this indoor range that we utilize, that I've been talking about and mentioning, when it is working appropriately, is that it does face an edge, and it's done through a remote. That basically the remote that the instructor or another assisting instructor on the line would help to control that, to have that targetry then face or then to go away into edge.
So go on to stage 2, please.
Yes, ma'am. So stage 2, we'll see here is at the 3-yard line. There's going to be 5 rounds that are going to be fired during this repetition. There's only 1 repetition of this, and this is where you're utilizing ambient light. I mentioned earlier that this is a low light qualification, not a no light qualification. Being that it's a low light qualification, there is lights that we leave on in the rear of the range to provide some ambient light to the officers while they're out there. That ambient light, how is it used? In this case, during the procedure, is they're starting from the holster, meaning they're having to draw their firearm from the holster, using ambient light that they have on the range with their night sights that they have on their pistols to identify that active threat that exists. They're going to draw and they're going to fire 5 rounds, strong hand supported. Strong hand supported is with both hands. Normal 2-hand shooting. Strong hand is with the pistols in, and then supported with their support hand or their weak hand. They would draw and fire 5 rounds, strong hand supported. The targets would be exposed for 6 seconds. There'd be a total of 5 rounds, which would get you your total of 11 so far for what stages have been completed.
And then the third stage.
Could you scroll down a little bit, please? So on the third stage, we have here at the 5-yard line, there's going to be 5 rounds as well expended. There's going to be 1 repetition. This is going to be ambient light again with a reload, an emergency reload that's conducted. The officers are starting from the holster. They're using the ambient light again with their night sights to identify the threat. They're going to draw and fire 5 rounds, strong hand supported, reloading as necessary. They have 10 rounds or 10 seconds to complete this staging. 10 seconds to complete the 5 rounds with an emergency reload within that time period while the target's facing. That's going to be 5 rounds expended to increase the total to 16.
Okay. The fourth stage.
Fourth stage, at the 5-yard line, 5 rounds, 1 repetition using a handheld flashlight. They're going to be starting from the holster with the handheld flashlight. They can start that either from a loaded shoulder or a forward grip position. But with this, once the threat presents itself and they identify that threat, then at that point they are going to transition to a handheld flashlight technique of their choice. So starting from a loaded shoulder or a forward grip at the hip, they could go to one of the other handheld flashlight techniques that the department utilizes that we refresh them on during that PowerPoint at the beginning of the day. They then would activate their flashlight to identify their threat and realize it's an active threat. They're going to draw and fire 5 rounds using the flashlight technique of their choice as I've described to you. They have 7 seconds for that stage, 5 rounds total again to raise it to 21 rounds that have been expended thus far.
Let's pause here, and I would ask you to explain, because you've mentioned it a couple times, what is an active threat?
Yes, ma'am. So I'll define what a threat is and then what an active threat is. So ultimately, in training, we try to emphasize and say is that what is a threat? A threat is an observation or a person that has raised some intention, some type of alarm, some type of cause that possible threat of death or physical injury may be imminent. Okay? That's what a threat is. An active threat is when it's rose to that level at that point that we know that an immediate threat or risk of death or serious injury has occurred or will occur. Okay? So active threat is that it's risen to that level. So what do we use when we identify? All right, as I've explained on the procedures here, we talk about, and as it notes in the procedure column here about identifying the threat, that comes into play with target identification. So identifying what that threat is and seeing that it's a threat. So that's when I mentioned active threat versus threat. That's what those are.
So threat could be a person just standing there with a gun.
Correct.
And how does that person standing there with a gun then become an active threat?
If the person has made a movement or to cause to say that potentially that it is increased to where now there's an immediate risk of serious injury or death. So if that person then that's as Ms. Whaley has described if they're holding the gun down by their side, but then now makes a movement to bring the gun up towards not only maybe the individual that's perceiving that, the officer, or someone else, that they're trying to then bring the gun up on someone else. That then makes it becoming an active threat.
Okay, move on to stage 5.
You scroll up a little bit, please. Thank you. Stage 5, it's at the 7-yard line. There's 5 rounds that are expended during this stage for 1 repetition. Again, utilizing the handheld flashlight. They're going to start holstered with the handheld flashlight, beginning at either that loaded shoulder or forward grip at the hip position. The light will be on at this time, and then once the target's face and then the threat presents itself and the officers identify the threat, then they're going to draw and fire 5 rounds using a handheld flashlight technique of your choice. All right, they would use that handheld flashlight technique that they wish to use for those 5 rounds. They have 9 seconds that the target is facing and exposed for a total of 5, getting us to 26 total.
And stage 6.
Stage 6 moves to the 10-yard line. 5 rounds are expended, 1 repetition. At this time, it's still with the handheld flashlight, but it also is building in an emergency reload. They're starting from holster with their handheld flashlight. Again, it's the handheld flashlight is in a loaded shoulder or forward grip position with the light already on, illuminating downrange. Once the threat faces and they identify that that is a threat, an active threat, then they're going to draw and fire 5 rounds using a flashlight technique of their choice. And then they're going to conduct, whenever it occurs for them, an emergency reload to reload. And then if they have not expended or have not completed all 5 rounds, then they would finish and complete those 5 rounds. They have 14 seconds to complete this stage in, 5 seconds for this stage, 31 total so far.
And stage 7.
Stage 7 is at the 10-yard line again. They will expend 4 rounds, 1 repetition. This stage, if the officer is equipped and has on their firearm a weapon-mounted light, then they may utilize the weapon-mounted light, or they may utilize the handheld flashlight. If they do not have the weapon-mounted light, they would use the handheld flashlight for the remainder of the qualification. If they have the weapon-mounted light, they can choose to use that. If the weapon-mounted light were to fail, the batteries were to fail, then they need to go back to using the handheld flashlight as they would normally do so. This stage is done from a compressed ready. Compressed ready is what we call position 3 of the draw. In a typical 4-step draw, when an officer is coming from the holster, step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to 4 full extension. Step 3 of the draw is here, it's compressed. It's at a ready position, it's compressed against the body, the muzzle barrel is level with the threat, and the front sight is in our peripheral vision. All right, and that's what a compressed ready is. So the officer is out of the holster at a position 3, compressed ready position, and they may utilize either the weapon-mounted light, or at this compressed ready position, they can have the handheld flashlight in a technique of how they choose or how they wish to hold it. They may do so at this position. Going to the procedure section is that from that compressed ready position, when the threat presents itself, they will acquire and identify that target or that threat, and they're going to fire those 4 rounds, and they can utilize, again, either the weapon-mounted light or they can utilize the handheld flashlight. All right. They have 6 seconds for that stage to complete it, expending 4 rounds, getting to a total of 35.
And stage 8.
Stage 8 stays at the 10-yard line, 4 rounds expended, 1 repetition. Weapon-mounted light or handheld light, this time they're coming from the holster. So if they have a handheld flashlight that they choose to use, they can start that from a forward grip at the hip or a loaded shoulder, just like they've previously done. And then once the threat presents itself and they identify it, they're coming from the holster, they're drawing, and they're firing 4 rounds using the weapon-mounted light or the flashlight. They have 8 seconds to complete this in, 4 total rounds, getting to a total of 39 rounds.
When you say 4 yards or 3 yards or 5 yards, is that the distance from where the officer is standing to where the target would appear?
Yes, ma'am. So the targetry, the target stands are fixed, and they're in a position there on the bases of the target stands. And then within the range that we have, the indoor range, there's lines marking the floor as well as on the wall marking the yardage distances for each line where it states in that second column where the yardage lines are.
And stage 9.
Stage 9 moves back to the 15-yard line. There's 3 rounds expended for 1 repetition. Utilizing either, again, a weapon-mounted light or handheld flashlight, they're starting this one at the compressed ready as they did previously. From the compressed ready position, when the threat presents itself, they're going to acquire that threat and that target, identifying it, and firing 3 rounds using their weapon-mounted light or their flashlight. 6 seconds is the time that they have for that, for the exposure of the target. 3 rounds expended gets them to 42 rounds total.
What does the phrase there, acquire target, what does that mean? How is that accomplished?
Yes, so ultimately is that talking about the fundamentals of marksmanship and pistol marksmanship, and particularly here, is that you have to acquire your target and utilizing those appropriately. So when we talk about the marksmanship principles, and we talk about stance or your position, we talk about your grip, we talk about when you come from the holster, you're getting a sight alignment. As you're pressing out, you're starting to align those sights. And then you're also then getting a sight picture, which is properly aligned sights on your target. You're doing breathing, you're focusing on your breathing, you're doing trigger control, and then you follow through and recovery as you're doing your shots. So with this, as we talk about, and it mentions here about acquiring the target, that's building in ultimately is that I'm practicing all of those fundamentals and putting them all together appropriately. And then when I'm acquiring my target, getting good sight alignment, getting good sight picture, at that point too is I'm also identifying my target, all right, and identifying what the target is. I'm isolating that target, and I'm also understanding about what's around it when I talk about earlier with the background or mentioned that 4th firearm safety rule.
10, stage 10.
Stage 10 stays at the 15-yard line. 3 rounds are expended. There's 1 repetition for this. This is a weapon-mounted light or handheld. They're going to come from the holster on this last stage, draw and firing 3 rounds utilizing their weapon-mounted light or their flashlight. They have 8 seconds for this stage to be completed, and then that's 3 rounds that should be expended for this stage, getting to them a total of 45 rounds.
Handing you document marked Chronicles Exhibit 152. Also handing you this box, evidence box. What is Exhibit 152?
What you handed me for Exhibit 152 is the Louisville Metro Police Department's Firearms Qualification form. This one is the one that we utilized, and also for fall of 2019, and it shows Detective Hankison's information as well as scoring that's listed on here.
So it's a score sheet and all the specific details of the gun he used for the low light qualification.
Yes, ma'am. As well as listing other information about other firearms that may be utilized or were utilized for this qualification.
He, and we're not going to go through it in detail, but he also qualified on another pistol in addition to the duty weapon that
Yes,
day.
yes, ma'am. There is another secondary duty plainclothes service pistol that's listed on this form.
And is that, you signed that form, the score sheet?
Yes, ma'am. My signature and name and code number are printed on the instructor portion of the qualification sheet.
And so it fairly and accurately depicts the score, the gun, and so forth.
Yes, ma'am.
Move to admit Exhibit 152.
No objection.
It'll be so admitted.
Now, If you would, open the evidence box there and identify that as the duty weapon used by Detective Hankison on the low-light qualification that day.
Yes, ma'am.
You can verify the serial number.
So looking at the serial number on the receiver frame of the pistol, it states LMPD 0256, which corresponds to the serial number LMPD 0256 listed on the qualification sheet that has been introduced and you placed in front of me.
Okay. Now, what was the score for the low-light qualification 10 stages that you just went through? What was his score?
The score listed here for the raw score for Detective Hankison was 225.
And how does that, what was the possible score?
The maximum points that were possible were 225 points. That was the maximum that was listed.
So it was a perfect score.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, the document there, I think the third block down in the middle, says WML make. What is that?
Yes, ma'am. So as I stated previously, weapon-mounted light. So on this form, it notates whether they had a weapon-mounted light or not, and we're utilizing that. In this case, it's marked yes, and then the weapon-mounted light make, or WML as it's abbreviated, would typically correspond to the manufacturer for that light. And then the model on the next section, WML model, would correspond to the model for that light.
And so, what does a weapon-mounted light do? I know you explained earlier that the officers could use either the weapon-mounted light or the handheld flashlight. So, how does that work?
So with the handheld flashlight is through the techniques that we utilize, you're still shooting one-handed, but you're shooting supported with the handheld flashlight. In placement, depending upon the technique that you're doing, you're still shooting one-handed with the handheld flashlight. Whereas with the weapon-mounted light is actually attached through a rail that's on the pistol. If I may demonstrate to show you, just right here on some of the models of the pistol.
Can you hold that up just a little bit?
Some models of the pistol, there is a rail that some of them may have, such as this one right here. That rail has an opportunity providing where if the officers wish to have and to utilize to carry that, then can place a weapon-mounted light. The weapon-mounted light, by being mounted on the pistol, affords the officers the opportunity to then shoot with a normal two-handed grip to putting two hands on the pistol, all right, to be able to provide that better platform and support to it throughout and practicing the fundamentals of marksmanship appropriately.
So the exercises with the weapon-mounted light are still designed to hit the target.
Can you?
But they're still in the ambient light, as you explained earlier. Using the weapon-mounted light or the handheld light, the idea is to be able to see the target better?
Yes, so the weapon-mounted light or the handheld, either one that's utilized, will help to illuminate what that threat is and to identify if that is an active threat or if it's a threat, as the example we gave previously, that somebody's holding a gun down to their side, for example, that's not risen to the level of an active threat. So the light, whether it be a weapon-mounted light or a handheld, helps to be able to identify the threat.
And during any of those exercises with the stages you went through, is there ever a object placed in between the officer and the target?
For the qualification that we conduct in this qualification here, no, there's not an object that's placed in between. They have their yardage that they're set at, as I described in the qualification, and then they have their target on what lane they're shooting on that they have downrange.
Could you point out where on the gun there, if you want to hold that back up, where the sights are?
Yes, ma'am. So the sights on here, you'll have your front sight towards the front of the pistol, and then you'll have your rear sight here towards the rear of the pistol, if you can see it. Rear sight and front sight.
And what are how are they used?
So as I mentioned previously, is that you have to have proper sight alignment. So aligning the front sight and the rear sight notch, having where in a terminology that's easy for people to kind of understand, especially new to shooters and remember, is kind of equal height, equal light. So using my fingers as an example, if this is the front sight and this is the rear sight, and I'm trying to align those, then I'm getting equal height across the sights, the front and the rear, when that front sight is in the rear sight notch. And I'm getting equal light. I'm aligning that front sight in the rear sight notch so that way that there's equal light on both sides or that it's aligned properly. That gets us sight alignment, and that's what that is.
And point out where the trigger is.
The trigger on this Glock 22 Generation 4 .40 caliber is right here. This is the trigger within the trigger guard.
And where is the finger in relation to the trigger during these exercises?
So as we state within the third firearm safety rule, is the trigger finger is kept high outside the trigger guard. So typically we will tell officers that they should have that trigger finger placed high up here on the slide where that it's away from the trigger. That way is that they do not place the finger, obviously as the third rule of firearm safety as I've shared with you, inside the trigger or on the trigger until they made the decision to shoot. So it's high on the slide.
Now, during the actual shooting, does the finger stay on the trigger for each round?
So could you expand on that, what you mean exactly?
Do they have to, so if they're expected to shoot 5 rounds in one of the exercises, does the finger have to come back out and put in a high position after each round?
No, ma'am. The trigger finger would stay on the trigger, utilizing the function of the pistol and how it operates and how it should be utilized appropriately. It has a trigger reset, so then that way as the gun cycles and goes through its cycle of action, then at that point, then the trigger would reset, and then the officer is resetting the trigger and then staying at that wall, as we call it, and then they're able to then, once they've done proper follow-through and recovery, where the front sight has settled back down, back on their active threat that they have, and they have proper sight alignment again and proper sight picture, and the front sight settles back down, the trigger is reset, and then they're ready if they have to fire, if it's necessary to fire that second shot, that third shot, that fourth shot, or in your example, the fifth shot.
So the trigger is reset after every shot.
Yes, ma'am.
And if you would scroll down to there we see the second gun that the defendant, Hankison, qualified with on that day,
Yes, ma'am.
and that was also a Glock. What kind of gun was that?
That was a Glock 26 model, and it was the serial number's listed there, and it's 9mm caliber, and it was a personally owned firearm.
9mm.
Yes, ma'am.
And what was his score on that qualification?
The score for this one, which was conducted with the lights on, it's our normal pistol qualification, was listed of a raw score of 214.
And so this was a different, instead of the low light that you went through earlier, this was a daylight qualification.
Yes, ma'am.
Then, just go ahead and scroll. There would be an opportunity for a shotgun and a rifle. Did the defendant qualify with either a shotgun or a rifle on this day?
No, ma'am, there's not either a shotgun or a rifle. It's listed on the qualification sheet.
but that would be common. An officer could qualify for all four then, actually.
Yes, ma'am. They ultimately, as was on the schedule that was introduced earlier, is that any firearm that they wish to continue to utilize in the performance of their duties, or carry as an off-duty pistol while within Jefferson County, they are to qualify with.
Scroll down to the bottom there. And what is noted there on instructor comments?
Yes, ma'am. So it states there, instructor comments, remove shotgun and rifle. It's just an administrative note for us internally within our firearms training center, is that if an officer that had previously qualified with a firearm no longer wishes to carry or qualify with that firearm, we make an administrative note so that way we can take it out of the active database or inventory and place it in the inactive to show that they're no longer utilizing or do not have a current qualification for that firearm.
So that's why that note was made there,
Yes, ma'am.
because he did not qualify for a shotgun or rifle.
Yes, ma'am.
And the date we see down here for that qualification,
The date that's listed on the qualification form is 10/21 of 19, October 21st of 2019.
and then on the left, he signed, and that's your signature on the right.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, you told us earlier that in the afternoon, there was exercises with simulators. And you said there were two different exercises, that half the group would do one and then they'd switch. Was there one called the DOT training?
Yes, ma'am.
And what is that?
So we emphasized, and as I stated earlier, when we have the officers for an 8-hour training day or an 8-hour day, we accomplish qualifications, but a qualification is simply a qualification. We also want to emphasize forms of training. So being that it was discussed in the PowerPoint at the beginning of the day and talking about the fundamentals of marksmanship, and particularly pistol marksmanship, is we're trying to emphasize and work on that during the training portion for the officers. So during that, the handgun fundamentals training is we were trying to emphasize and work on with the officers during that afternoon. One of those afternoon segments and portions was on proper handgun marksmanship fundamentals.
Handing you what's marked Commonwealth's Exhibit 153. And explain what's shown in that document. There's 2 pages there.
Yes, ma'am. So the first page that you handed me, the one on the top, the first page lists out a picture of the upper portion of one of the training targets we were utilizing for this handgun fundamentals dot training. And we have under each of those dots, or each section corresponds to what the course of fire and the training that was conducted during this training portion of the dot training. The second page is another dot training target that's titled or has a term dot torture, but it has, similar to the first picture or page, it has the same type of training thoughts and concepts.
So do those documents accurately reflect the dot training?
Yes, ma'am.
Move to admit Exhibit 153.
No objection.
They'll be so admitted.
So here we see the dots. Can you explain, starting from the top left, what is involved with this training?
Yes, ma'am. So again, ultimately is that it's working on proper utilization of pistol marksmanship fundamentals. So with that is that we are emphasizing to the officers and the students that we're working with them, taking a test or a qualification out of the equation and just trying to get where someone as an individual and as a student can relax to be able to learn in a proper atmosphere, to be able to learn the proper application of those fundamentals. And if they're not doing something correctly, we help diagnose what they're not doing correctly to help them fix it for proper utilization of the fundamentals. We want to get them to the point we always emphasize of self-diagnostics, to where they can self-diagnose what they're doing incorrectly, so that way they can fix it if something's not working appropriately for them in utilization of the fundamentals. For this drill, starting from the top left, we have a series of 4 dots along the top. This first one states from the 3-yard line, they're starting from that position 3 or compressed ready, already out of the holster as we've talked about previously. And then either on the target or the threat facing at that point, or either on the command. They are told of command of fire or shoot or threat, that they are told then to press out to full extension, position 4, and they're going to put a single shot in this dot. They will continue this, if instructed by the instructor at the time, to continue to do so each time a single shot from position 3 to position 4, practicing the fundamentals properly, following through and recovering appropriately each time, till they've done all 5 rounds within that first dot.
Now, is this done, this is back out on the range?
Yes, ma'am. This is done on the range with an instructor walking through and or demonstrating each stage or each section before they do it and explaining it.
But as opposed to the morning with the silhouette, moving silhouette target, these are dots, actually.
Well, and that silhouette target was a facing or edging, not a moving laterally, but it was a facing or edging, and that was with a silhouette. This is one, yes, ma'am, working with using the dots for the training.
Okay, go on.
So in the next dot over to the right, it states also from the 3-yard line, starting from position 3 or that compressed ready, the officer would press out to position 4 full extension and then would do a controlled pair. A controlled pair is firing 2 rounds, and it's controlled because there is a sight picture for both of those shots. All right, it's not quickly, rapidly pulling the trigger twice. It's making sure that you have that sight picture, the sight alignment sight picture comes back that you have for that second shot. And then getting proper follow through and recovery after that and utilization of the fundamentals. They will continue to do that for a total of 5 times to get where they get a total of 10 rounds that have been expended.
Go ahead to the next dot.
The next one over is moving back to the 5-yard line. They're also doing this from position 3 or compressed ready. And these again is similar to what they did on the first one, except we've added 2 yards to it. They move back only 2 yards. And they're doing the same thing, single shots, until they've done 5 rounds at this stage. The last one is similar to what they did on the second one, but again, it's at the 5-yard line, 2 yards further back from, again, position 3 or compressed ready, doing now controlled pairs until they've done 5 controlled pairs to get the total of 10 rounds expended.
Now, number 1 at the bottom.
So on this target, can you scroll up a little bit, please? So on the number 1 at the bottom here, this one's done from the 7-yard line. This one, they are drawing from the holster. The dot size is increased just a little bit, but the focus is still, they need to have the focus to be able to try to keep those rounds in that number, for example, all right? So they're doing this from the 7-yard line. They're coming from the holster and they're firing a single shot. They're going to do that each time from the holster 3 times till they've done 3 rounds.
Now, the last 2, that's a combination. That's the 6th.
Yes, ma'am. So for the last one we have here with the next 2 numbered dots, we have that this is from the 7-yard line. This is also coming from the holster and to where they're having multiple targets. They're going to utilize a controlled pair or 2 rounds per target. This has been done in methods of either having it done where you have 1 target, such as this up there, and they're transitioning between 2 and 3 as their 2 multiple targets, or a target that's next to them, their partner's target, to give more span. May be that they would say that you're shooting on your number 2 target, and then your partner to the right's number 2 target. They're shooting on their 3 target, your 3 target. So that way you get more span that you have there. This is simulating with multiple targets, is that you may have 2 individuals that are active threats that you have to engage, but you have to perceive and identify the level of those threats, if it's a threat or an active threat. But then also with that is, if, for example, if I have somebody that's armed with a pistol and I have somebody that's armed with a long gun, all right, which one is the one that I maybe need to deal with first, because they're active threats trying to either hurt me or someone else, is that in this case with multiple targets, as I'm addressing the one with the long gun first and then going to the one with the pistol, and then indexing back over to the first one to ensure that they're no longer still an active threat. So that's that last 2 dots trained on multiple targets, dealing with 2 different targets in controlled pairs.
In addition to the dot training, was there an active shooter training in the afternoon?
Yes, ma'am. So what was listed on the schedule at the beginning was the firearm simulator training. So the firearm simulator training, there was a scenario that was selected. The chief's office at the time stated that to utilize the firearm simulator and to pick an active aggressor or active shooter type of response that an officer may face, and to utilize that as the scenario within the training.
And explain how that training works. You said it's a simulator. Can you explain?
Yes, ma'am. So the firearm simulator basically is a computer-based system with a screen. You have some simulated cover that you could have within that room. The officer is standing on a line in front of that screen with a projector and also speakers providing sound to the situation. The officer's there in front of the screen, and at that point, they're also equipped with a Glock, similar to a Glock pistol. It's one that is not functioning or reciprocating for us, but that the trigger will reset in it, and it also is equipped with a laser device to be able to synchronize or link up with the computer system that we're utilizing in the screen. They're faced with pre-recorded situations on this computer-based system, to whereas it may be a situation that an officer may face, and the officer is having to go through the situation utilizing their training, their de-escalation skills, to be able to realize what tools may be necessary or what techniques are necessary to handle the situation. How that officer responds in the scenario appropriately, or how they respond to what they do, dictates how the instructor that controls the station of how the scenario continues or how it goes. So basically, there is a firearms instructor or an instructor that's in that room that is controlling the loading of the scenario, as well as that officer or student is going through the training.
So it's actually a video of a person that they would then, in various positions, that could become or not an active threat.
Yes, ma'am. There's pre-recorded videos that have been pre-recorded by the company and uploaded to the system, and those are depicting different types of sounds, visual things that they may see, as well as different types of threats or active threats that they may encounter.
So if, and I guess the goal of the exercise is to make sure they don't shoot when it's not appropriate active threat.
The goal of the active shooter one was ultimately it's gauging on appropriate active shooter, active aggressor response by a law enforcement officer, and utilizing all the skills and training that the officer has had, whether it be from firearms, whether it be from active aggressor training. It's putting all of them together and all those skills and training to be able to utilize it appropriately.
Now, talk back to your definition of threat. Can a muzzle flash in and of itself be a threat?
Based on my definition of a threat, a muzzle flash is a threat.
Explain.
So, as I stated, is that if you have a muzzle flash, or if you have a muzzle or gunfire, the sound of gunfire, is that potentially, in my definition that I stated earlier, a threat? Yes, because a threat is, as I stated, an observation or a person that has provided some instance, some type of warning, some type of occurrence that raises the possibility of some type of death or serious injury, that it could be imminent.
So how would a muzzle flash become an active threat?
So translating over to an active threat, when you have an active threat, you have an active threat that immediately poses immediate risk of death or serious injury. With that comes all the fundamentals that we've discussed and I've talked about before, where it comes into play with target identification, target isolation, and your target background, as tied in with the 4th firearm safety rule.
So you would need to see something more than just a flash for it to be an active threat.
Based on our training that I've discussed, is you would need to have those fundamentals and those practices in place.
And so what would you need to see?
You need to have target identification, you need to have target isolation, and understanding of the target background.
And what is target identification?
So target identification is identification of what that perceived threat is and what level of that threat it is. That if it's just a threat, as we gave examples of, or if it's an active threat. That's identifying that target and what it is.
And what's target isolation?
Target isolation is understanding that I'm isolating what that perceived threat or target is, what level it is, but then isolating it from any others that are in close proximity or the area around it.
And target background?
Target background feeds into understanding what that fourth firearm safety rule is, of ultimately understanding what is around your perceived target or threat. When I say what's around it, what's in front of it, what's beside it, what's behind it, what's beyond it.
So you would need to go further to identify the target if you just see a muzzle flash.
Based on our training and what I've discussed. Yes, ma'am.
You would need to go further to identify a target
Yes, ma'am. Based on our training that I've discussed.
connected to just a muzzle flash.
Yes, ma'am.
And is a target or a threat, can a threat be other than a person with a gun who's creating an active threat? In other words, could it be an animal situation?
Can you state that again?
Other than a person with a gun that would be an active threat, is there another entity that could be an active threat, such as a wild animal getting ready to attack the officer?
Yes, I mean, if you had, our policy also allows for, is that if someone is being, if the officer or another person is being attacked by an animal, that a firearm may be discharged in that case due to what they're being faced with that as well.
And the officer is trained to be, before shooting in response to threat, is trained to be able to see the threat.
Going back to target identification. Yes, ma'am.
That's the same thing as seeing the threat, identifying it.
Yes, identifying the threat. It goes back to and corresponding to the qualification and what we talked about there is identifying the threat.
Now, if the term shooting in response to active threat, shooting until the threat has ended, can you explain that?
Can you define or explain what your
Well,
question is?
Is that a term that's recognized to shoot? Is that a term that's used in training? Are officers trained to shoot until the active threat has stopped?
Yes, it's ultimately is that the officer, what they're perceived and what the action that's being produced that's causing that immediate threat of death or serious injury. Once that individual who's an active threat has ceased the demonstrated actions is when no longer that you would continue to respond accordingly with deadly force.
So in order for an officer to be continuing to respond with gunfire to an active threat, each and every time a target has to be identified.
You
Each
have-
and every time the officer shoots.
Based on our training, you have to have those areas and those fundamentals as we've talked about.
Okay. I believe that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, cross-examination?
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Gelhausen, you indicated you've been with LMPD for 14 years, correct?
Yes, sir.
What is your rank, or what is your title?
A police officer.
Police officer?
Yes, sir.
And during your 14-year career, have you always been assigned to the Firearms Training Center?
No, sir.
How long have you been at the Firearms Training Center?
Since 2018.
What other kind of assignments have you had?
I've also been assigned to other duties within the training academy as a patrol officer, as well as some other specialty area assignments.
Have you ever participated in the execution of a search warrant during your career?
Yes, sir.
How many times?
I can't tell you the exact number off the top of my head, sir.
Would you agree with me that service of a search warrant is an inherently dangerous task?
Yes, sir, it is.
Have you ever been fired on when serving a search warrant?
No, sir.
Okay, we've established that LMPD officers must qualify twice a year, correct?
Yes, sir.
The spring is a short 4-hour qualification.
4-hour time period or an on-duty that did come within an hour time block.
And then the fall qualification's the big one, correct?
Fall qualification is the 8-hour time period.
And you indicated that that runs from, what did you say, September through December?
Typically, it usually will start around September through December.
Okay, and I assume that you can't train everybody at the same time, correct?
What do you mean by that, sir?
Well, you can't train the whole department in one day. That's why it takes that period of time.
Correct, yes, sir.
So Brett Hankison, I think the document showed his fall qualification was October 21st or something like that.
Yes, I think as the document reflected, yes, sir.
And so he was with a group of how many people?
Usually for the fall qualifications, that the max sign up for that, or the number of people able to be enrolled for that time period, is 24 students.
And is that something that the officer himself signs up for, or does somebody say, here's the day you're going?
It could be either of those two.
Okay. The fall qualification, you indicated that there's some simulator training, correct?
Yes, sir.
First of all, there's a silhouette that they shoot at, is that right? Not in the simulator training, but in the initial qualification.
During the qualifications, yes, sir, there is a silhouette type of target for the
And
qualification target.
What, is that a paper target?
Yes, sir.
And they're shooting live rounds, correct?
Yes, sir.
Um,
Live range ammunition.
Which is different from,
It's different than the duty ammunition. It's basically, it's a range ammunition due to us being a lead-free frangible. It's a lead-free frangible ammunition because we're a lead-free range.
but does it have the same effect as duty ammunition?
The manufacturer states that it operates similarly but not the same.
And who chooses, there's a bazillion different kinds of ammunition, is that correct?
I don't know about
That may be an
there's
exaggeration.
There's a lot, yes, sir.
There's a lot, correct?
Yes, sir.
Who chooses the ammunition that the LMPD officers use?
So the Firearms Training Center does the research and provides the guidance, but ultimately the department command staff decides is what progression or what direction we're going. But most of the time, they're relying ultimately on the Firearms Training Center's guidance and research.
And does everybody on the department use the same ammunition?
For duty, are you referencing for duty ammunition?
For duty ammunition?
For duty ammunition, the department has one set type of duty ammunition for that caliber that officers are told that they should be carrying in accordance with policy.
And what kind of ammunition is that?
It's federal premium tactical, and it's a tactical hydroshock ammunition.
Okay, I don't know a whole lot about guns or ammunition, but I've heard the term hollow point versus round bullet. Is that a distinction?
It's similar, yes, it could be.
What is a hollow point?
So a hollow point was similarly like an HST or a hydroshock type of round, or the bullet, where maybe it'd be indented a little bit in the top, and then as you define it, I think a round tip or a round point or a ball round or ammo would be where it does not have, it's lacking that, and it's just a round tip or a solid ball type of projectile.
And what type of projectiles do the LMPD officers use?
We use for duty use.
Yes.
For duty use, it's that federal premium HST tactical law enforcement round.
And is that a hollow point?
It's similar to, it's what federal calls their HST round.
What does that mean?
Without getting into the specifics and having it in front of me, I can't define and give you what federal calls it, but it's their HST round.
Okay, well, can you give me a basic lesson here in what a hollow point is versus a round point?
So yes, so the hollow point ultimately is in how it's designed by the manufacturer and how it's intended is kind of as it makes contact with clothing, with fibers, with human tissue, it can kind of open up or mushroom a little bit, where it comes into play with the stopping power, for lack of another word, but the stopping potential of that round and how it operates. And that's just giving you some basics. I don't have a lot of the certifications and knowledge to go in depth anymore on the rounds or anything, but just giving you some basic understanding to answer your question there.
Okay, well, my understanding is that a hollow point is designed to strike something, spread out, and basically stop. Is that correct?
It could. It just depends upon the type of round and how it's manufactured and what the manufacturer's intended purpose is and the utilization by the agency.
And so if someone fires a hollow point, say at this wall here, is it supposed to stop it when it hits that wall?
Depends upon a lot of different circumstances, and every situation is ultimately different without being able to know the specifics of the utilization and the construction of the material.
Have you ever seen a hollow point shot through drywall?
I've not personally, no.
Does a rounded bullet generally travel farther than a hollow point?
I can't speak to or give you any explanation without having some better knowledge about that.
Okay. So the officers shoot at this paper silhouette target, correct?
Yes, sir.
And as I understood your testimony, it moves around?
Ultimately, it just faces and edges. Faces and then edges to go away is what that is. It does not move laterally.
And is that where Brett Hankison scored the perfect score?
Where was that?
When he was doing that qualification with the silhouette
The
target?
low light qualification was conducted on our range, yes, sir.
With the silhouette targets, correct?
With the LMPD standard qualification target, yes, sir.
And LMPD, if I understand the policy correctly, gives officers 3 opportunities to pass the test, correct?
Pretty much, sir, but yes, and then remedial training and then continued attempts.
And Brett Hankison qualified on his first attempt, is that right?
According to the exhibit in the qual sheet, yes, sir,
With a perfect score.
with the max score of 225.
And then on his off-duty weapon or his personal weapon, he scored, I forget, was it 219 out of 225? 214 out of 225?
214 out of 225, yes, sir.
Okay, would that indicate that he was fairly accurate with his shot placement?
It just depends ultimately, I don't recall or cannot remember exactly his qualification on that secondary duty plainclothes service pistol about his shot placement or where it was.
Okay, well, let's talk about his on-duty weapon, where he got 225 out of 225. Does that indicate that he's a fairly accurate marksman?
That ultimately is the standard of qualification for the agency. That's ultimately, there's a difference between qualification and training. And ultimately, a qualification, again, the agency sets what the qualification is, just like the Commonwealth of Kentucky state law sets what a qualification is for active duty officers. The agency adds to that with a qualification, but that's not training. We complete a qualification, but a qualification is kind of a completing the qual, and then you move on to the training because of what the importance of training.
Okay, you kind of lost me in there, but
Okay.
the qualification is to go out and shoot at the silhouettes, correct?
Shooting at the LMPD standard qualification target, yes, sir.
And how about the dots? Is that part of the qualification?
No, sir. It's part of training.
Part of training, okay. The training, all of this takes place in controlled situations, correct?
Yes, sir.
There's nobody out there shooting back at anybody.
No, sir. Not in the training that we've talked about today.
Okay, and you even talked about the simulator, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's a video, the officers watch a video on a screen and have to react to it?
Yes, sir.
And that's kind of like a shoot, don't shoot scenario,
Yes, sir.
where some people you should shoot and some people are not active threats, correct?
Yes, sir.
You talked about this low light qualification of Brett Hankison and ambient light. What is ambient light?
So ambient light is the light that's available to you within the room. So for the low light qualification, as I mentioned and talked about, a couple of stages where there's ambient light available and utilized, and it's during the low light qual, there's ambient lights on, meaning in the rear of the range during that qualification, providing ambient light. Two, which shines down for identification of the target in lieu also, or connection with also using the handheld flashlight or the weapon-mounted light.
And are there any no light qualification?
With
scenario?
no lights on at all?
Yes.
No, sir.
Okay. As part of the training, are officers taught to assess the situation before they discharge their weapon?
Can you define, what do you mean on that, sir?
Well, if an officer is faced with a threat, is he taught to assess before he discharges his weapon?
Yes, sir.
If he's faced with an active threat, is he taught to assess?
Yes, sir.
And what does assess mean?
Assess ultimately ties into, we talk about the three that we mentioned, identifying what that threat or that target is and what level of threat it is, isolating that threat and that target, and then lastly, the background assessing. So we're looking to make sure that, to see what's around that subject or that threat or that individual, but then also too, seeing what else is around it, and also making sure that there's not any others that are around it, or if there's other additional threats.
And that, all that assessment takes some time, correct?
Depends on what do you mean by time?
Well, it takes seconds at the minimum to do all those functions, correct?
Quickly, yes, sir.
Quickly. What about a situation, first of all, would you define somebody that actually fires a shot and hits another officer? Is that an active threat?
Can you explain that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Okay, if I'm a police officer and this is a door, and I walk through that door and somebody shoots me, is that person that shoots me an active threat?
The person that shoots you and you're at the door, that's an active threat, yes. But it also depends upon also understanding of perception and also placement as far as other threats.
So I'm not, so I would, before I could do anything, if I'm shot at, in your testimony here, I would have to sit there and think about how to respond, correct?
You as the one being shot?
Me as the one being shot, or me standing next to my partner who's been shot?
Again, as you noted and talked about as far as time and how quickly it must occur to be able to go through to think about these things, is that you're doing those things as we've talked about, and you're identifying, you're isolating, and you're understanding the background as you're going through this and addressing and dealing with whatever that is and making your decision to address that threat, what level it is, if it's an active or not.
Well, if I've just been shot, I think it's pretty safe to assume it's an active threat, correct?
Yes, sir.
And when you say I have to identify and isolate a target, if I've got somebody shooting at me, do I have to be able to physically describe that target?
You have to identify what level of threat it is. So, and you utilize tools or means to be able to do that. And that ties in with being able to utilize whether ambient light's available to you, or also utilizing the tools that you may have, such as your weapon-mounted light or handheld flashlight.
When you served search warrants, did you ever walk up to the door? Well, first of all, how do you turn that weapon-mounted light on?
There's a toggle switch, an activating switch that on the models that we have are at the tail cap.
And where's the tail cap?
It's at the rear of that light when it's mounted on the rail. That it's here that you utilize your support hand thumb to activate it, to turn it off and on.
So that's another step an officer has to do, correct?
Correct, yes, sir.
And when you were actively serving search warrants, did you ever approach the place you were going to search with your weapon-mounted light eliminated?
I can't recall exactly on that, but ultimately it depends upon the situation, the circumstances, and training, and there's reasonings for whether you have your light on or why you keep it off. There's reasons for that.
Each situation is different, correct?
Yes, sir.
Some situations, you light your light. In some situations, it's better to approach in the dark, correct?
Ultimately, depending upon what you're facing is what you utilize and how you utilize it.
And if a door is breached when you're executing a search warrant and somebody fires a shot at you, how long would it take to flip on your flashlight?
I can't give you exact time of how long that takes. It goes back to training.
Officer Gelhausen, when you say you have to identify a target, again, is it necessary to be able to describe the physical characteristics of the target?
You have to identify that it poses immediate threat of death or serious injury.
Okay, so what if that target appears to you to be a silhouette and it has just fired a shot that struck one of your brother officers?
I can't speak about the understanding or the circumstances of the case without the knowledge and understanding of all the circumstances around it.
Okay, well, let's just play hypothetical here. If I breach a door and the partner next to me gets shot and I see a silhouette, can I fire at that silhouette?
I don't know what you're perceiving and what you're seeing and what you're going through at that point, sir.
Okay. Would it be a fair statement on my part that officers are not taught to shoot, stop, assess, shoot again, stop, assess, shoot again if it appears to be necessary?
You're constantly always assessing throughout. And that goes back to my response to Ms. Whaley about when the threat ceases and how do you determine that when I gave that explanation. So there's constant assessment that is occurring.
But would you agree that one of your training exercises is that when you make the decision to shoot, you shoot until the threat is stopped, correct?
Which training exercise are you speaking of?
I don't know, one of the training exercises that you have during your 8-hour qualification.
Can you rephrase or can you explain your question again that you're asking?
As an individual, as part of your training, when an officer makes the decision to shoot, to discharge his weapon at an active threat, is he taught to shoot until that threat is stopped?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
With the understanding of all the principles and fundamentals that come with that, as I've stated earlier.
And what if this active shooter situation is lasting for a total of 5 to 15 seconds? Is an officer still supposed to, at that point, do the fundamentals?
You're always practicing the fundamentals and you're continuously assessing the needs and the utilization of what you're using.
And they're supposed to do that to the best of their ability, correct?
Based on their perception and what they're dealing with, all the circumstances, and based on the training.
Are you familiar with the LMPD use of deadly force policy?
Yes, sir.
Does that require that officers, when there is a deadly force, an active threat, that they neutralize that active threat to protect themselves and their brother officers and other citizens?
As policy states, is that if somebody is posing imminent threat of death or serious injury to their self or to another, that they utilize deadly force if they see fit.
And if they use that deadly force, they have to follow the shooting rules that you outlined to the best of their ability, correct?
Going back to training, following the training and the proper use of the fundamentals and following policy.
Would you agree that there are situations that arise where an officer, if he pauses with indecision on whether to fire a shot, that could be fatal to him?
I can't speak to that because ultimately understanding perception, everybody's situation that they face, as you stated, is different, but also too based on the perception of the officer and what they're going through.
And every officer perceives things differently, correct?
Depends upon what's going on with the situation, having a true understanding of it.
Would you agree with me that it's improper to view anything an officer does through the eyes of 20/20 hindsight?
What do you mean by that, sir?
Well, have you ever heard the term Monday morning quarterback?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If an officer on the scene where all chaos is breaking loose, all hell is breaking loose, he makes a decision to stop a threat, would you agree with me that it would be improper for you to go back and look at that and say, well, he didn't have proper target identification, he didn't know what was behind him or behind the target, beside it, or in front of it? Would you agree that that's...
Counsel, would you approach for a moment? All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've been going for about an hour and a half, so this is probably a good time for us to take a break. We'll take a break for 15 minutes, and please remember the separation admonition.
All rise for the pledge, jury.
Anything to report from the break, ladies and gentlemen? All right, we'll continue with cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Officer Gelhausen, I have just a few more questions.
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with Louisville Metro Police Department policy and procedure concerning the appropriate deployment of long guns, of long-barreled weapons?
I'm familiar with that policy, yes, sir.
What is that?
If I could, I'm not able to speak it verbatim or explain it to you verbatim without actually looking at the policy.
Would you agree with me that the appropriate time for appropriate containment of barricaded subject situations with a known weapon is a time when long guns may be brought out?
It could necessitate the need for that, yes, sir.
And I don't know if you've addressed this or agreed with me or not, but would you agree with me that a person who fires a shot at a police officer and that shot strikes the police officer, would you classify that as an active threat?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, you do this, you talked about a little bit about the simulator training that you do. That's the videos, correct?
Yes, sir.
Would you agree with me that that's pretty realistic?
To a certain, it has its limitations to a certain extent. I mean, with the way that it's designed, it's intending to do that as much as it can.
But it certainly is not real life, correct?
Correct.
Have you ever timed yourself firing a fully loaded Glock?
No, sir.
Do you have any idea how long that takes to unload a fully loaded Glock by firing it?
There's a lot of different factors that come into play. I do not know off the top of my head, sir.
Would that be a matter of seconds, perhaps?
Yes, sir, potentially.
Would you agree with me that you nor anyone else could testify as to what Brett Hankison perceived on March 20th or March 12th, 2020, March 13th?
Restate the question, please.
Would you agree with me that on March 13th, 2020, at 3003 Springfield Drive, when this event occurred, that neither you nor anyone else could testify as to what Brett Hankison personally perceived?
Yes, sir.
And if Brett Hankison had failed to be able to describe a target and know what was around it, and so on the rules that you talked about, did he have any alternative other than to just run away?
Objection.
Sustained.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Anything on redirect?
No, Your Honor.
All right, you can step down. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, the Commonwealth's next witness.
Yes, Your Honor, it's going to be Cheryl Snyder.
If you take a seat, please. Counsel, would you want to get the exhibits unless you're planning to use those?
No, ma'am, I'll get it.
Thank you. If you'd raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I will.
Thank you.
Please state your name for the record.
Cheryl Snyder,
And where do you work?
Louisville Metro Police Department.
And what position do you hold at Louisville Metro Police?
I'm the Human Resource Director,
Okay. And how long have you been in your position?
18 years.
Okay. And in that position as the director that you just stated, do you have the ability and the role of overseeing HR files, human resource files in the department?
Yes, sir.
And do those include employment records?
Yes, sir.
And at some point during your time with LMPD, was John Mattingly employed by Louisville Metro Police Department?
Yes, sir.
At some point after this case, was he released from the hospital and cleared to return to service?
Yes, sir.
And at some point after that, did he choose to retire from Louisville Metro Police Department?
Yes, sir.
And just so that we're clear, do you know what date it was his official retirement would be effective?
Yes, it was June 1st of 2021.
Okay. So just a little under a year ago.
Mhm.
When that effective date became on June of 2021, how many years of service would John Mattingly have had with Louisville Metro Police Department?
He had 20 years, 11 months, and 27 days.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Snyder. I think that's all the questions I have for you.
Any cross-examination?
No questions, Judge.
All right, you can step down. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, the Commonwealth's next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. It's going to be Officer Philip Renaud, Renaud.
If you'll take a seat, please. If you'll raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I swear.
Thank you. You may take your mask off while you're testifying if you wish, but you're not required to.
Okay.
Yes, we're still in the morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Please state your name for the record.
Officer Philip Renaud,
And where do you work?
Louisville Metro Police Department, 8th Division,
And how long have you been with the Louisville Metro Police Department?
about 6 years.
Okay. How long have you been assigned to the 8th Division?
Since March of this past year.
Okay. Where were you prior to the 8th Division?
The 1st Division,
And were you in the 1st Division back on March 12th to March 13th of 2020?
yes.
And what was your assignment in the division at that point?
Force beat as a patrol officer.
Okay. And what was your assignment that evening in particular? What do you do in that role?
Just beat cop, answer calls for service.
Okay. And when you were out answering calls, would that be patrolling?
Yes.
Okay. And that evening, did you receive a call reference 3003 Springfield Drive here in Louisville, Kentucky?
Yes.
Can you just kind of go through how you heard about that?
If I recall correctly, the call for officer needs assistance at 10:30 came out over PD3, which is the channel the 1st Division operates on. Responding to that call, I put the address in my GPS and responded.
Do you know how long it took you to get there?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. When you got there, were other officers already on scene?
Yes.
And when you approached the scene, were you directed to go anywhere? What was your assignment when you arrived on scene?
I don't believe anyone directed me to go anywhere. I looked for work, and it looked like the back of the apartment complex didn't have many officers at it.
Okay. Now, when you got to the back of the apartment, how long did it take you to get from the front to the back?
From the front of the building,
Yes.
oh, it's less than 30 seconds.
Okay. When you arrived in the back of the building, how many officers were on site?
At least a couple more. I don't know how many.
Okay. And did they advise you of anything that was going on in the rear of the building?
Not that I can recall.
Okay. When you got to the back, what did you personally see?
I observed what I believed to be a window or glass door that had multiple bullet holes through it. And I thought that that was the target apartment of the search warrant that had been served.
Okay, so you could actually see bullet holes?
I could see broken glass.
Broken glass, okay. Now, when you're standing there, is anyone directing traffic, for lack of a better term, or are you just on your own?
Pretty much on my own, with between me and the other officers, just trying to find the best point of cover for
Okay.
safety.
At some point when you're back there, is your body cam on?
Yes. Or off or on?
On,
On. It was on the whole time.
okay. And when did you activate this?
I believe it activated around First and Jefferson when I started my code 3 run to the address.
So you had it rolling throughout the scene?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to show you in a second what has been marked as Commonwealth's exhibit. If you hold on one second. It's going to be marked as Commonwealth's exhibit 71. You'll just take a look at the screen here, please. Do you recognize what that is?
I'd say it's the apartment complex in question, but I've never seen an aerial shot of it before.
Okay. Is that the apartment complex 3003 Springfield that you responded to that evening?
Yes.
There's a laser pointer up there. If you would just take and show us where you initially arrived to and then where your placement is in relation to the building, if you can.
Okay. I would have come up this road here. There's a gate there, if I remember correctly. Then I came down this way, saw that there were quite a few officers out front, and I came to this back corner here.
Okay. And is that the position that you maintained throughout your time at the apartment?
To the best of my recollection, yes.
Okay. And your body cam was rolling throughout that?
Yes.
Now I'm going to show you what is preliminarily marked as Commonwealth's Exhibit 154. This clip that I'm about to show you, have you had a chance to review this prior to today?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm going to show you just a brief second of this. Is this the body cam that you were rolling that night when you arrived at 3003 Springfield Drive?
I believe so, yes.
Is it a fair and accurate depiction of what you saw that evening when you arrived?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time I would move to admit Commonwealth's Exhibit 154, which is the body cam of this officer, and then we'll play for the jury.
Objection?
It'll be so admitted.
Officer Rayno, I'm going to go for a second, and then I may pause it and ask you a few questions.
Okay.
Aaron, you might
Yes, sir.
get the lights turned down.
Yes, Anthony, if we could turn the lights down just a little bit. Can you get one more? Is it, if not, it's... Okay. What exactly are we viewing here, Officer Reno?
This is the back of the apartment building itself. And because we didn't have any good cover, we're just kind of on a hill.
What are you doing in this photo with your gun, your light? Can you just describe the scene for us, what you're personally doing?
This point, I guess I don't know why we don't have the audio, but I believe at this point we see the broken glass, so I'm using the weapon mounted light on my rifle to attempt to illuminate the area. I was, and I still am, unfamiliar with the layout of this apartment complex, so I believed at the time that that back glass led to the target apartment. So that's what I'm observing and covering.
At some point, do you ever see anyone come out of that apartment, expose themselves? What do you see?
Yes, at some point there was what I believed to be a shirtless white gentleman that kind of just showed himself from that broken window, at which point I hail him, tell him to show me his hands. He shows them for a second and then ducks back into the apartment for the remainder.
At that time, did you believe he to be the suspect?
I believed him to be related in some way. I mean, we came onto the scene with limited information, so I didn't know what the suspect was supposed to look like or what the target even was.
Your Honor, I'm going to pause this and see if we can get the audio to work. How long approximately do you hold this position back on the back of the residence?
I don't remember how long we were out there, but from the time I got there and till the time we left, that was the only position I held on the apartment.
Okay. At some point, do you all approach the residence at all?
Yes. I guess we'll see it here in a moment. After, I believe it to be after the SWAT team cleared the actual target apartment and told us that no one was inside, we approached the broken glass.
Was that the first indication that you had that this apartment was in fact not a threat to you?
Yes.
I'm gonna move the clip forward just. In a second, I'm gonna have you describe what we see when you begin to move. When you were in this position right here, there's other officers you testified about. Are there any, is a canine officer there? Who else was there with you?
I know there was a canine officer. He would have been to my right. Aside from that, I know there were other officers. I don't know an exact number, nor do I know who they were because they weren't my direct partners that I usually work with.
Okay. Is this dog a narcotics type dog or patrol type dog?
I believe him to be a patrol dog, but I'm not canine, nor do I know what dog it was.
Okay. Who gives you all the actual order to move up here?
I don't know that anyone gave us an order to move up to the.
So it was only SWAT that was able to indicate that they had cleared that you moved up?
If I recall correctly. Yes.
What do you see when you get to this point?
There's the glass door that's broken. That's all I was able to see. I didn't see anyone else at this point. Whoever was in there had retreated further back into the apartment.
What do you do next here as we see you walk away?
At that point, I believe I went up to the front for maybe a minute to find my partner, and then I went back to my car to go back to the First Division.
Okay. And then after returning from that portion of the apartment complex and returning to your partner, did you have any further involvement in the scene at all?
No,
You did not re-enter the scene?
no.
Those that were out back, not the canine, those officers that were out back, did they all have rifles with them?
Not all of them. I know there was probably a mix. I don't remember.
Were they all armed?
Yes, we're all armed police officers.
Okay. And when you were armed, you're pointing it at what you assessed at the time to be that apartment who you thought was the target at the time?
I was, yes.
I think those are all the questions I have for you, Officer Renaud. Thank you.
Cross-examination?
Thank you, Your Honor. Officer Renaud, when you first arrived on Springfield, you testified there was a gate.
Yes.
You remember what the condition of that gate was?
I remember that it was run through with a car. There was a light bar laying on the ground. I actually remember the radio traffic of somebody telling an officer to ram the gate.
Do you know who told the officer to ram the gate?
I do not.
When you arrived, you proceeded through the gate and went up to 3003 Springfield, correct? Or up to the area of the apartment that was at issue?
Yes, sir.
And you got out of your police cruiser and you testified you went around the back, correct?
My police cruiser was actually probably a quarter-mile back on whatever that main road is. I couldn't tell you which road it is, though. But
Well, is that because there were so many police cruisers on
Yes.
Springfield? So you walked up through the gate, correct?
that's correct.
Okay, and why did you had your rifle with you at that time?
Yes, sir.
Why did you have your rifle?
Better shooting platform and has a better flashlight than my pistol does. It's dark.
Had you been told to bring a rifle?
Not that I can recall, but somebody had just shot at police officers, so,
And so you proceeded around the back of the apartment building, correct?
yes, sir.
And why did you go around the back?
I was trying to find a helpful spot to be. I was just looking for work. The front had a lot of officers,
Okay, nobody told you to go around and cover the back?
not that I recall.
And you testified that when you went around the back, you saw a window or a glass door with multiple bullet holes, correct?
Yes,
Were there multiple bullet holes, or was it simply broken glass?
I guess what I could see is simply broken glass.
You don't know how that glass broke, correct?
That's correct.
And it was your impression at that time that that apartment was part of the apartment that was being searched in the front, is that right?
That was my impression at the time, yes, sir.
And you indicated that you took up your position and you kept your rifle pointed at that broken door throughout that video we just saw, correct?
Yes, sir.
And why was that?
I believed it was possible there was a threat still inside the apartment.
And you later learned that the apartment was not part of the original situation, correct?
That's correct.
Could you see that apartment from the front of the building?
I'm not sure.
I don't have anything further, thank you.
Anything on redirect? You can step down, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
The Commonwealth's next witness? You may. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this will be a good time for us to go ahead and take the lunch break. So we will be in recess until 1:15, and please remember the separation admonition, and I will see you back then.
All rise for reporting jury. Yellow lunch box and whatever.